Welcome to the Design Systems Week 2024. This is the first talk of the week with Gert Hengeveld. Gert is a full-stack engineer at Chromatic for about 5 years now, and he's one of the maintainers of Storybook. Storybook, of course, in the NL Design System community, we know it well. Last I checked, we have over 20 storybooks with thousands and thousands of stories in a wide array of technologies. Super excited to hear about this from Gert himself. Yeah, go ahead, Gert, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert. I hope everyone can hear me now. I unmuted myself, so you should be all good. So welcome and good morning. Happy to kick off this NL Design Systems Week as the first speaker at the conference. And we're gonna dive into like a fairly technical topic straight away. So fasten your seatbelts because it might get a bit technical, but we'll see. So yeah, I'm here to talk to you about testing user interfaces, testing UI, specifically doing it the Storybook way. Good morning. My name is Gert Hengeveld. I'm presenting to you from lovely Amersfoort here in the Netherlands. But in my day, this is the office I work in on a day-to-day basis because I work remotely for a company called Chromatic. Chromatic is an American company, and we build our own SaaS product, and we maintain Storybook. We have a whole team on staff to maintain Storybook full time. That's because our product is built on top of Storybook for the most part. So we are heavily invested into Storybook. Of course, we also do it because everyone at the company has a strong open source mindset. All the founders do, I do, and all the other maintainers also have done a lot of open source development over the years. And now we are like all working on Storybook. Well, this is not news to anyone, I hope, that user interfaces these days are built with components. All of the modern UI libraries and frameworks, they've all switched are all based around components, like React components, web components, Angular, you name it, they all use components. And the lovely thing about components is that, well, you can reuse them in a lot of places. So you build up your design system or your component library, and then you use those components when you start to build your applications. And there's also a bunch of downsides to components because a lot of complexity is involved because every component has endless variations, such as states, loading states, disabled states, error states, all the states that you need to consider. Then there's edge cases, long or short content, or missing data, special characters, a lot of things to keep in mind when you develop your components. So, and then there's context. What's your language? Are you offline? Are you running an A/B test? Do you have like a dark mode preference? And to top it all off, there's countless combinations of all these variations to your components. And you can see how quickly this can get out of hand if you want to test all the variations of these components. So covering all these permutations is a lot of work. Say you have this one component.
Gert, just checking. Did you intend to share your screen already or not yet?
Am I not sharing my screen?
No, not yet.
That is interesting because I did. Well, that is unfortunate. I'm sorry about that. Let me jump back a little bit to the start of my main content. So user interfaces are built with components, like I mentioned, and you reuse these components. Then every component has endless variations, like states, edge cases that you need to keep in mind, and then context that you also have to consider. And then there's countless combinations of all these variations. So when you want to cover all these permutations in testing, that's a lot of work, right? You have one component, and then in Storybook, you'd write a bunch of stories for a bunch of variants of such components. So say you have 4 stories, and then you want to test them in multiple browsers and in multiple viewports. So this really excessively gets out of hand very quickly. So the issue is then bugs start to slip through undetected if you don't have your testing game in place. So say I have this one component, I have it on one page or one screen of my application, on another one, and it all looks good. And on the last one, all of a sudden, the positioning is all wrong. And then if you don't test for all these variations, that starts to slip through, and your end users might encounter those bugs instead of you. So let's look at one example from MongoDB. MongoDB is a database company. It's a very large company registered by the NASDAQ, publicly traded, and they have a button component. Like, don't we all? We all have a button component in our design system. Well, this button component is not just a humble button component. Because this button component is, of course, used in all kinds of places. Take a modal or a drop down. There's all sorts of variations to this one button component. And so in MongoDB's example, they have considered size, icons, an icon position, coloring of the button, and a bunch of other things that they need to consider. And that amounts to over 1,500 variations of this one button component. So you can see that's where things get really gnarly. So Storybook is here to help you manage all that complexity and manage all those variations. It's a tool to develop components in isolation, so you don't have to spin up an entire application to work on a particular component. It helps you to catalog all the components that you have and all the variations thereof. It helps you to test those complex user interfaces and the interactions that those UI components might have, and then allows you to document your component library for sharing with your coworkers or sharing with stakeholders. So for those who aren't familiar with the tool, Storybook uses a stories format. We have a specific type of file. In this case, it's badge.stories.js file, which looks a little bit like this. And it's like a JavaScript file that allows you to specify some metadata about this component, and then all the stories that you want to define for the stories. And in this case, it's just this badge component, which has a small variant and a large variant, which translates into the size arg here, small or large. So in a context of a designer to development handoff, Storybook is really on the development side of the thing. So designers often use something like Figma to design their components and do a handoff to a developer who often uses Storybook then to build the actual component. Sometimes it's a designer who does this instead, but for most cases, we target front-end developers, front-end engineers as our main audience from Storybook side. And Storybook has really quickly become the industry standard for UI development. Storybook's been around for, I think, 8 years or so at this point, and it's been used by all of like thousands of companies around the world, a lot of them really well known. This is just a small sample size. Testing UI code is really hard. So we need to test all of this because it's all highly complex, but doing the actual testing is pretty hard. So there's components might break in unexpected places. Testing all these scenarios is a lot of work, so doing manually isn't really feasible. Reproducing a specific state can be very tricky. So say a customer ran into a problem on your web application, how are you going to reproduce that issue? If it required a particular state of the database or state of the application to be in, it's really hard to reproduce that. And that's why developing your components in isolation makes it easier to reproduce things, because you can control all of the context, all of the data going into your components. Unfortunately, the tools we have at our disposal aren't really tailored to UI testing. There's a lot of testing tools out there, but those testing tools, they kind of come from the back-end development side of the world and aren't really tailored to UI testing. So how do you test user interfaces anyway? So manual testing is something that everyone does, right? You have to always have some sort of manual testing, even if you do it unconsciously. While you develop the component, you're clicking on the thing, you're playing around with it. That's also already manual testing. And Storybook is actually great for this because you have controls as an add-on to Storybook, which allows you to play around with the data that goes into your component. Unfortunately, it's not scalable to do this. Then there's the solution to automate the process, right? An end-to-end testing framework such as Playwright that allows you to control a browser to click around for you. Like you write a script and you say, okay, click here, type some text into this input box there, and then check that something happened that I expect to happen. Unfortunately, these things typically run against a live application like a staging environment, and that means that you have to have a running app with like a database behind it. You have to spin up the entire thing, and also that also means that the state of the application matters, and so the order in which you run your tests matters oftentimes in an end-to-end testing situation. So that makes it really hard to orchestrate these things, and also fairly slow and can be very brittle, so easy to break. And then there's unit testing. So frameworks like React, Next.js, right, Vue, they all come with some sort of a testing, some sort of testing utilities. These are unit testing utilities typically. So the issue with those is that they kind of pretend that your UI is an algorithm. Like data goes in and some sort of data comes out in the shape of like a DOM, like HTML. But that's not the whole story. That's only part of the story. And then there's, of course, many more flavors of testing, performance, accessibility, all of those things. And also visual testing, which we'll get to later. But for now, these are the main things that are like the big items. So the Storybook way is component testing. We are betting big on component testing. Component testing is a particular style of testing, which is sort of like the combination of manual testing, end-to-end testing, and unit testing combined. So you take the best of those three worlds and you combine them into component testing. And what remains in practice is that you take your unit testing approach for performance, speed, ease of test definition, but you run it in an actual browser using something like Playwright. So that's the end-to-end phase, but you don't actually run against a live application. You just test the one component. And then there's manual testing, giving you the ability to actually manually inspect what's going on with your component as it is being tested. So component testing in Storybook means you can write your stories with assertions. So we have extended the component story format to allow you to write assertions or tests on your stories. And what we then do is we take your stories, your story files, and we automatically generate v-test test suites for your stories. A v-test test suite for your stories. So we generate a test file based off your story file, so you don't manually have to do that. And then we offer a test panel to visualize all the steps in your tests, allow you to step through the interactions and debug the tests in your browser, your development browser. And finally, giving you tooling to measure code coverage. And all of this is available now in Storybook 8.3. So here's what a little test looks like. So this is a component story file with a added play function. So this play function here is something that's executed after your component has rendered inside of Storybook. And then inside of the play function, you can simulate events and run assertions. So, and then when you run your Storybook in your development on your local machine in development mode, what you get is something that this can run in any browser, typically your development browser, and you get a log of the interaction. So that's the events that happened during this thing, and also finally an assertion. So the brilliant thing about this is that you can inspect elements right there, use your browser dev tools right there, and also step back and forth in time through the interactions of your test. So that means you can pause midway and then inspect the some element to see what's the current state of my UI. So let's look at an example. This is actually what I want to show you is how test coverage is affected by running these things. So I have prepared a little demo. This is Meal Drop, which is a demo project we use. It's like it's a design or like a storybook for a food delivery application. And so let me show you. We have this testing tab. This is using the vtest extension to Visual Studio Code, and I can run my tests. But there's only 9 tests right here because what I have is a bunch of test files for some where are they? Some hooks, for example. Right. So here's a .test.ts, which is a regular unit test. This is a unit test, the vtest unit test. And you can see here that sure, this file has 74% code coverage. This one has 100% code coverage. But overall, my source directory only has 2% code coverage, which is pretty appalling, really. But what I don't want to do is have to go and write a bunch of unit tests to get my code coverage up to scratch. So what we've done is we've actually got an add-on, the Storybook experimental add-on test. Let me add this. npx storybook add storybook experimental add-on test. This gives me a little setup. It says like, oh, hey, I'm the installation helper, and it's configuring Playwright with Chromium for me. It's setting up a vtest setup file for Storybook and creating a vtest workspace file. So let me show you what that looks like. It generates. So what it's done, it's added some dependencies to my project. This test add-on, it's created a vtest workspace file with Storybook test setup for me. So even if you already have a vtest tests set up for your unit tests, this will actually extend your regular vtest config with Storybook's vtest config. So now we have two configurations in one workspace. And then finally, we get this vtest setup files, which makes sure that all the annotations, Storybook specific internals, are wired up correctly. And now if I run my test again, and you see, now I have tests here for stories, and let me run it again with code coverage. This takes a little longer because now it's not a unit test that runs in Node, but it's actually something that runs in Playwright in an actual browser. It's running in a headless mode, so I don't actually see it. You can run it in head full mode so that you can actually see that browser running. But now if we go back to my Explorer, you can see I now have 87% code coverage coming just from all of those let me look at my page directory from the stories files that I have, right? So I have category detail page of stories.tsx that's giving me 81% code coverage on my story detail page component, which in that case, like an entire screen. So that's how it helps you get up to scratch with your code coverage. So that's already currently available in Storybook 8.3, but we're not stopping here. We have bigger plans for UI testing. We want to unify the UI testing experience inside of Storybook. So we're bringing the UI into testing. They're bringing you UI to test your stuff. So what we're going to offer in Storybook 8.4 is a way to run those tests directly from inside of Storybook. So inside of the Storybook UI, you're going to get this little testing module at the bottom of the sidebar that allows you to run component tests and visual tests from inside of Storybook. It reports back into the sidebar. So when there's failures like errors or warnings, those will actually be shown as red and yellow dots in the sidebar on a story. So you can directly click on that story to see what's going on and debug it right there. You can connect multiple test providers. We're starting out with component tests and visual tests, but this is a generic API that anyone in the community can hook into to add other types of testing if they want. There's an option to toggle watch mode, so you don't have to manually run them. They will actually run whenever you save a file. You can run tests per component or per story, and actually filter the sidebar by status. So those little red and yellow boxes at the bottom, you can click them to filter. Actually, I have an example here. I think, yeah, you can click them to filter the sidebar to only show errored or failed or stories with warnings. You can see, you can drill down into the details of saying, oh, there's accessibility errors and there's coverage warnings, which this is actually a mock-up. This is not yet implemented, but this is where we're going. This is the direction we're heading in. And then you saw the visual aspect to it. That's powered by Chromatic. Chromatic, we launched, I think about a year ago, we launched the visual test add-on to Storybook. So you can run Chromatic visual tests from within Storybook. That's already been available for a little while. We're now also integrating that into this testing module inside of Storybook. So for those unaware, Chromatic, well, essentially that's a cloud platform that allows you to publish and share your Storybook online. It's behind authentication if needed. And then giving you tooling to bring your team on board with the UI changes. So you can approve and track visual changes over time. And we have a tool for visually reviewing pull requests. So we call it's UI review. UI review is like code review on GitHub, but instead it shows you screenshots side by side of your main branch and your feature branch, so you can see exactly what's going to change visually when you merge a pull request. And you can assign a designer or a manager or another stakeholder to review those changes before you merge the PR. And finally, we sync status with GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket to prevent your PR from getting merged until those visual changes have been approved. So that's it in a nutshell. But if there's anything you take away from this, is that you can write stories and get tests for free. Thank you for listening. My name is Gert Hengeveld, and I hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you so much. I see a lot of applause coming from the audience, digital applause. Yeah, so we have time for some questions. A couple of questions. If I see a couple of questions in the chat as well. So if you are not able to put your question in the chat, please raise your hand. One of the questions is like, I see that it's very cool that you can now integrate accessibility tests here and all those things. Can you also integrate those tests in CI? Can you also block CI with like Chromatic if you have a broken accessibility test?
Yes. So what we're doing is we are integrating with vtest, and vtest is able to run in CI. So definitely you can set it up to run in CI and prevent your build from succeeding in CI. And eventually Chromatic will also be running these tests and report back through GitHub and like Git status updates, like the last thing I mentioned. So that would apply to also accessibility tests once we have that integrated. That's a little early, but we have plans to roll that out in 2025. Early, hopefully first 6 months of 2025, but I can't make promises because I'm a product manager, but we have plans in that direction, yes.
Yeah, super nice. A lot of the things that you've shown, people already benefit from a lot of these things in the NL design system community. I know we have a lot of visual regression testing, and I'm very excited to see this integration. Personally, I'm very excited to see this integration with PyTest because we do have a lot of tests, but they are not integrated into Storybook yet. So that's nice. A question from the audience is, how well does this work with non-React frameworks? I saw you use testing library. Isn't that like framework agnostic?
Yeah. So we're standing on shoulders of 2 tools, or 3 actually. So it's VTest or PyTest, testing library, and testing library is available as like React testing library, but it also exists for Vue and Angular and other things. So that's agnostic, yes. And then there's mock service worker for mocking out network requests. So those are the 3 tools that we combine, of course, with Storybook to run tests and mock out the data that you need.
Yeah, nice.
So yes, it should be totally agnostic, or at least we are supporting as much as we can realistically, which is mainly, of course, React, Angular, Vue, Svelte right now, and of course, and we sort of rely on the community to make the rest also happen, because we are a team of like 10 people working on Storybook full time, but we can't do everything, unfortunately.
No, of course. And it's also nice that you have like a get by role text box, which should work like if you write a test for either Angular or React, it should work all the same.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's great about testing libraries, that it does things in like an agnostic way. Like it encourages you to do things like get by role, which of course is better in many ways, including being agnostic to the framework. Yeah.
Yeah, so one more question from the audience. Could you explain code coverage in a nutshell? Because I saw this progress bar, which looked very cool, but what does it actually mean?
Yeah. Sorry, that's a bit of the technical side of the presentation. Is that code coverage? The idea there is that you want as much of your code covered as possible. I mean, to a certain extent, but the point is that code coverage sort of proves that your tests that you are testing your code. So if you don't have coverage for a part of code, then you know this is like a blind spot. I haven't verified that this is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And code coverage isn't like perfect by any means, because it can still, like, you can write an assertion or something that covers all the code but doesn't actually check anything. So it's really still up to the developer to make sure that they're testing the right things. But it's giving you sort of like a guide on what to look at. Like, okay, this file doesn't have much code coverage, so maybe it would be a good idea to take an extra look at this file. What is it doing? And can I write some tests to make sure that this continues to do what it's supposed to do as I like make code changes, like refactor code, because that's ultimately what tests really make like power, is that if you have a lot of automated tests, it's much easier to make large code changes like refactorings to your code base, because otherwise you're flying blind. So
yeah, so basically, if you have like 60% code coverage, if you don't have code coverage for that 40%, you could replace the 40% with any random code, and your test would still succeed because like that code wasn't part of the test.
Yeah. That's a good summary. And I'm not saying that we should strive for 100% code coverage, because typically that's not realistic. But I feel like 80% or something is typically like a good. If you have that, then you're in a good spot. Yeah. Most companies don't, though. I mean, neither do we, honestly.
Yeah. So one more question is, if you render a story, Will that be part of code coverage, or is that just is that a separate thing?
Yes. So the nice thing about what we do with vtest and converting story files to test files is that even if you don't write any assertions, no interactions, we still render the component, which makes it sort of like a smoke test. Like, does it render at all? Does it not throw an exception? Does it not crash? And so, yes, we help you do that too.
Yeah, thanks. Like the last question would be, you mentioned like there are like 1,500 button variations, which means that you have like 1,500 screenshots times 4 browsers times many viewports, which is like thousands of screenshots for every commit, um, counting toward the budget, whichever you have set. Do you have any tips for finding a balance between having screenshots you can rely on and being able to do a couple of commits per month?
Well, we have an answer to that. It's called TurboSnap. The TurboSnap is a chromatic feature that looks at your commit history, the code changes that you made in Git, and then it traces those files back to your story files, and it will skip any stories that you haven't touched in code. And that also, like, we actually trace the dependencies between regular old code files and your story files and your stories. So TurboSnap allows you to skip 60 to 80% of screenshots every time, and sometimes more. So if you if you make a benign code change that doesn't affect any UI at all, we don't run any screenshots because we don't have to. So that's the answer there, really.
That's very clever. We'll give that a try. I think we've all learned a lot during your presentation, and we have a lot of new things that we can try in our storybooks. So thanks again for being here.
You're welcome.